Holocaust Memorial Day takes place on the 27th of January each year and is a time to remember the millions of people murdered during the Holocaust, under Nazi persecution and in the genocides which followed in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia and Darfur. Today, the theme of our liturgy is love, learning to love one another and informing ourselves of the atrocities that have happened to our brothers and sisters. Today, we join to fight for justice and prejudice. Please stand. Please join me in making the sign of the cross. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. As we join in solidarity, let us say the prayer that Jesus taught us and unites us all. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name.
Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen.
A reading from the Gospel of John. As the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. Remain in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and remain in his love. I have told you these things so that my joy may be in you, and your joy may be complete. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that he laid down his life for his friends. You are my friends, if you do what I command you. No longer do I call you servants, for a servant does not understand what his master is doing. But I have called you friends, because everything I have learned from my Father I have made known to you. You did not choose me, but I chose you, and I appointed you to go and bear fruit that will remain, so that whatever you ask the Father in my name, he will give you. This is my command to you. Love one another. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
We are very honoured to have our guest speaker, Henneke Dye. We would like to invite Hanneke to speak to us now. Please take this time to reflect on her experience.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. And I just want to know if the people at the back can hear me without You can hear? Great. You can hear over there? Nobody puts a hand up. Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay, that's great. I don't really like a microphone, so I'll do my best to reach you all. So good afternoon, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today, to give my testimony. I understand that you have been learning about social justice, and you find examples in my talk and also injustice. So see if you can pick it up while I'm actually giving my testimony. The title of my talk is Born a Hidden Child, and it will become clear why it is called that. Now, first, before I actually start, I want to think about all the people in the Ukraine. Who would have thought that after the Holocaust there would be war in Europe? Just think about the school children who are of your age. Some have already been killed and some have had to flee. So I want you to bear that in mind in connection with what happened in the Holocaust, when obviously many more children lost their lives. I often ask myself if my life would have differed if the Second World War had not happened. Now, if I hold up this book, I think you will all know who this is. I'll do it a bit quick. But I think you'll agree that it's Anne Frank? Yeah? Yes? Yes? Anne Frank. I have a little in common with Anne. Both Anne and I are Jewish. Anne and Hanneke are both derived from the Hebrew name Chana, and you may have heard of the Festival of Light, Hanukkah. And also, with regard to Anne, as you know, Anne was hidden in Amsterdam, And I actually have a map here on the table where maybe you can look at it later and see where Amsterdam or all the other places I speak about. Right, so Anne and her sister, they perished in Auschwitz concentration camp. Her mother, however, died in Auschwitz concentration camp. And her father, Otto Frank, after the war, he survived. He went after the perpetrators of the atrocities and tried to bring them to justice. So I'm going to talk about my family, introduce them to you, and I start with this photograph. These are my father's parents, Marcus and Anna Bendik. And here is a very small picture of their daughter, my father's sister, Basa Bendik. And why do I mention these? And this is what they have in common with Anne Frank. They perished in Auschwitz concentration camp. I never knew them, and this is more or less all I have belonging to them. Now, they're very dear to me, and I love them deeply. My father was a diabetic, and therefore he needed insulin on a daily basis. And when the Nazis demanded for the Jews to gather in the park in Apeldoorn, where my grandparents had retired to, he felt if he went, he may have a chance to get his medication on a daily basis. And as his wife and daughter were at home with him, they decided to go with him. And of course what happened was that when the Jews had actually gathered in the park, they were simply marched to the station, pushed into cattle trucks, and first taken to a transit camp in the northeast of the Netherlands called Westerbork. And from there, they were sent again in trucks to Auschwitz, where they perished in November 1942. A terrible, terrible death. Now, I've got also good news to share with you, and these are my mother's parents, my maternal grandparents, Israel and Anna Samson. And this is a photograph of three of the children, and Uncle Jaap, or Jacob, and then in the center is Aunt Lena, his younger sister, and on the left is my mother, Grietje, a very Dutch name, which you don't find in Great Britain. Now just remember, I showed you a picture of three children, and then maybe later you will understand why I stressed that. Well, fortunately, they survived the war, and obviously it's very, very wonderful to actually be able to share these photographs with you. And they also lived in Apeldoorn, and that's how my father and mother got to meet each other. Apeldoorn, they had a number of Jewish families there, but most of them lost their lives, very sadly. So it was very good that actually my grandparents and their children survived. There are actually still Jewish people today that are still in hiding, and the hiding is in quotation marks. I don't mean they literally are hidden, but they have been unable to this day to speak of the traumas they endured during the Second World War. And so it was with my mother in a way. The Holocaust, or the Second World War, was a taboo subject in our house, and if I asked any questions, my mother either said, "Don't believe everything you read or hear," or, "Well, let's change the subject quickly and talk about something different." So you may therefore wonder how I did come to find out and share with you my story. Well, my Uncle Jaap, he wrote a little book. This is in Dutch because I'm a Dutch lady, and it's called My Holland of Yesteryear. And in here, he describes what mainly happened to the Samson family, so my mother's family, in other words. And that makes very interesting reading. So, very soon after my parents and grandparents were in their first hiding place in Apeldoorn, a friend warned my uncle, who lived in the south of the Netherlands, in a town called Breda, and you'll find that on the map, that his family were in danger and he had to come and rescue them. So Uncle Jaap traveled to Apeldoorn, and where they had been hidden was a house that belonged to a very good friend of Uncle Jaap. And that friend, for what he did, the bravery and risking his own life for hiding Jews, he was actually taken away and never heard of again. Uncle Jaap first collected his father, then it was the turn of my grandmother, and sadly my grandmother had a kidney disease which did cause some problems during the war, as she had to be taken into hospital, and for a Jewish lady to be in hospital would have been very, very dangerous. Then he went to collect my father, and lastly it was the turn of my mother. And as traveling in the daytime was very dangerous in those days, because as you probably all know, Jews had to wear a yellow star, so they were easily recognizable. And if they were recognized, they were mainly picked up and deported. So they traveled at dusk, so it was nearly dark, but not fully dark, and arrived in the town of Utrecht. And Utrecht is right in the center of the Netherlands, a very important railway town, even today, when trains to the north and south and east to west, or the other way around, all go through Utrecht. And very often, if you have to change trains, you trains in Utrecht. And furthermore, there were barracks, so it was an army town, no longer. But what is still the case today is that it also had a conference center, and therefore fairs and business exhibitions took place in Utrecht. So my uncle and mother arrived in Utrecht, and in those days, we're talking about the 40s, there weren't many hotels. And they'd hoped to get a room. They decided to share a room, as they would realize that it would be very difficult to get 2 single rooms. So they make do with a double. No chance, however, because they found there was a business fair, and therefore the hotels they approached were fully booked. And as they left the last hotel they'd visited and wondered where they would go, a waiter came running after them and said he'd overheard the conversation, and he knew of a lady in Utrecht who from time to time took in guests. A little bit like in Great Britain you do bed and breakfast, but in Holland that was very unusual. So Uncle and Mother arrived at the address given, and Uncle rang the bell, and as the lady opened the door, she said in German, what do you want? And Uncle immediately thought, oh my word, we've been betrayed. Anyway, he plucked up courage and said to the lady, we understand that from time to time you take in guests, and you may have a room available. She said, you are in luck. I have got 1 room, but it is the attic room. It's a pleasant room, 2 flights of stairs up. So Mother and Uncle climbed the stairs and found quite a pleasant room, really, with a double bed. Mom, by that time, was very, very tired. She was 7 months pregnant at that time, and so naturally the anxiety and the traveling had made her tired. She lay down on the bed, while Uncle sat on the edge of the bed, still wondering if they had been betrayed. And whilst they were trying to get to sleep, they were mainly kept awake by soldiers' boots going up and down the stairs, and they heard German voices. It wasn't until after the war that my uncle discovered that the lady of the house had been the girlfriend of a very high-ranking officer, a German officer, a Nazi. So there they had been under the eye or the nose of the enemy. But fortunately, they were able to leave in the morning. And having experienced a taste of danger, they decided they would travel separately to my uncle's house in Breda. And there, when they safely arrived in Breda, they were welcomed by my maternal grandparents, Israel and Anna, and also Uncle Jaap's wife, Aunt Nell. And Aunt Nell was not Jewish. She was Uncle Jaap's second wife. His first wife was a Jewish lady, but sadly in the first year of their marriage, she actually died. And the reason why she died was that in those days they didn't have antibiotics, and without antibiotics she wasn't able to get better. And we are so used to the overuse of antibiotics nowadays. Anyway, the other thing about Aunt Nell is that she was very, very blonde. So what the Nazis thought was, if you were blonde, you couldn't possibly be Jewish. And how wrong they were. Because Aunt Lena, my aunt, my mother's younger sister, was only 16, and although she wasn't as blonde as Aunt Nell, she had blondish hair. So she was able to go outside as Aunt Nell was. Now, Uncle Jaap now had a task of actually getting some identity papers, which were very important. Even to today, the Dutch normally have to carry an identity card with them. And what I've got here is 2 identity cards. I hold them up, but you can maybe come up later to have a look. These are my grandfather's identity papers. And I'm going to read to you both of them. One is the right one, and one is the false one. Now, let me see where I start. The correct one says, Samson, the surname of my grandfather, Israel, his first name, and often shortened to Is. He was born on the 17th of March 1890 in Amsterdam, and he was married to Hagenaar, surname, and A for Anna. And it also says he was a representative. And then, where he lived in Apeldoorn was Hoogakkerlaan 59, and during the war, he was actually for a while at Nightingale Street, and then after the war, he went back to Hoogakkerlaan, but to the house of my parents, which was number 61, so they were neighbors, as his house was still occupied. And what's interesting is that it has his photograph on it and his signature, but also in Holland this is called a thumbprint. Of course in England it's called a fingerprint. So now to the actual false one. Hagenaar wasn't a particular Jewish name, so he changed his name, and listen carefully. Now his surname is Hagenaar. He's called Johannes Peter, still born on the 17th of March 1890, but in a different town called Goes. And then again he was definitely still a representative, but now he lived in Church Street. So what did he do? He Christianized his name by calling himself Johannes Peter, the New Testament, and saying he lived in Church Street. And still the fingerprint and still the photograph, the same, the photograph and a different signature. What he'd hoped to do with that is if he had been picked up, he would have shown that particular false identity card, and he would have hoped that the Nazis wouldn't have thought he was Jewish. And fortunately, he got away with it. So that's a really good thing. Now also, my mother obviously, as I just mentioned, she was expecting a baby. And Uncle Jaap knew it would be too dangerous for her to give birth to a Jewish child in the hospital. So through his GP, he found a midwife who was willing to risk her own life to bring in the world a little baby. And there, on the 10th of February 1943, this little baby was born. Hanneke was born on the 10th of February 1943, so you can work out how old I am because I recently had my birthday. And there's two wonderful photographs of my mother in bed with this little baby. And also behind that photograph, behind the bed, is actually the midwife who was called Mrs. Soontjes. Now, if she had been betrayed by any of the neighbors, that would have been her life done. but she prepared the neighbors and said that a young lady had approached her, she wasn't married, to bring in the world her baby. And in those days, not to be married and bring a child in the world would have been almost unforgivable. So fortunately, we were still safe. And we stayed with the midwife, which was the norm in those days, for 10 days. And then Uncle Jaap would come and collect me. Now my first bed was the vacuum cleaner case, and vacuum cleaners in those days were sausage-shaped, not upright or circular as you have now. So you could have any vacuum cleaner you would like, but they had to be sausage-shaped, and they came in a big box, and the box was almost like a small coffin. It was black, leatherette, and what they did was they actually made holes in the lid and made the inside of the box like a crib, and that's where I was in. So I was born in hiding, and even going in that box, I was also being hidden, because when Uncle Jaap came, he put the box with the lid on the back of his bicycle, and he took me back to his house. And there I was for quite a while. By that time, he'd also found hiding places, because they couldn't really stay all together. It would have been too risky for his parents, and they went to a family in the town of Heerlen, which is in the province of Limburg, which is a southern province, which in those days was a mining town. But of course, like in Great Britain, there's no more mining in the Netherlands. The other thing I need to tell you about Heerlen and Mr. and Mrs. Langhorst, who again were very brave and risked their own lives to save Jewish people. My uncle and my grandfather were in the bicycle trade. They actually worked for a company called Gazelle, which was a very famous company in the Netherlands. So they had a lot of customers who had cycle shops. And so he went to his customers first to see if anybody was willing to actually hide his parents. And Mr. and Mrs. Langhorst did. And then, of course, he had to find a hiding place for my parents too. And more of that in a minute. So, as I said, they had been with Mrs. Saunders for 10 days, and then I went to Uncle Jaap's house, and one day Uncle Jaap and Aunt Nell were out, because in those days you used ration books, and they were looking for food with their ration coupons. I haven't got an example of that, they were all used, of course. And whilst they were out, Aunt Lena, 16 years of age, they had pretended that she was 14, so she could have this special identity card. She was babysitting, and I was hidden in the attic with a net curtain over me. She was happily just doing what she was doing when there was banging on the door. And when she opened the door, 2 big Nazi soldiers stood in front of her, demanding to search the house, as they had been tipped off that Jews lived in that house. Of course, they were right, but Aunt Lena, even at her young age, quick as a flash, came up with the following story. She told the soldiers that she had been orphaned in the bombing of Rotterdam, and Rotterdam was very badly bombed during the war, and all the heart of the city was taken out. Now, she hoped that by telling this story and saying she was orphaned, had come to live with her uncle, and she'd heard them talk about Jews living next door, but they had fled, that the soldiers would believe her. Instead, she was pushed aside, and those soldiers marched through the house, seeking. God smiled on this little baby, and I did not cry, and therefore I am here to share my story with you. That's the good news. The sad news is that my Aunt Lena, as she was so terribly young, was persecuted with the fear that she experienced that day and for the rest of her life she had terrible mental problems. I owe my life to my aunt. She is my heroine. But how sad the story ends.